He handed his daughter to crime and 6 months later received the worst punishment. Joaquim, a desperate father, sees his life fall apart when his gambling addiction leads him to do the unthinkable, incur a debt with the dangerous Sombra, the local crime boss. To pay it off, he is forced to make a devastating decision involving his daughter, Maria. Joaquim was a man marked by his gambling addiction. The sleepless nights in the illegal casinos of the small town where he lived had cost him more than just money. He had lost the trust of his family, the respect of his friends, and now found himself cornered by an exorbitant debt. Joaquim's biggest creditor was the Shadow, a feared local criminal known for his cruelty and lack of scruples. The Shadow controlled the city's underworld with an iron fist, running everything from illegal gambling to drug trafficking. Joaquim, having fallen into the Shadow's gambling web, thought he could win enough to change his life but ended up sinking deeper and deeper. With no options to pay off the debt, he was summoned to a meeting in an abandoned warehouse, where the air smelled of rust and danger. "You have 1 week to pay me," the Shadow began, his deep voice echoing through the empty space. "Or, alternatively, you give me your daughter." The proposal hit Joaquim like a ton of bricks. Maria, his only daughter, was an 18-year-old fresh out of high school, full of dreams. The idea of handing her over to pay off a debt was inconceivable, but the threat of death hung in the air, clear and imminent. Joaquim knew the Shadow wasn't bluffing. Tormented, Joaquim returned home. His mind was racing with the heinous proposal. He had no way of raising the amount required in such a short time. The debts accumulated from gambling were too high. Sitting at the kitchen table, he looked at a photo of Maria smiling. He felt the crushing weight of guilt and hopelessness. What could he do? Run? But where? The Shadow had eyes everywhere. Maria came home later, finding her father in a state of silent despair. "Dad, is everything okay?" she asked, concerned by the lost expression on his face. Joaquim tried to force a smile but failed miserably. He couldn't look at her without feeling a stab of pain in his heart. "Everything is fine, my daughter," he lied, his voice trembling. In the days that followed, Joaquim tried to find a solution, anything that could save his life without sacrificing Maria's. But every attempt to get money was thwarted by a lack of time and resources. The clock was ticking, and the pressure was mounting. He found himself in a prison of his own making, with no apparent way out. One day, while walking through the streets of the town, he met his old friend, Pedro. Pedro had always been a trustworthy person, and Joaquim decided to take a risk and tell him the truth. "Pedro, I'm in a bind. I need help," Joaquim said, his voice choking. Pedro looked into Joaquim's eyes, sensing the gravity of the situation. "What happened, Joaquim?" "You know you can count on me," Pedro replied, trying to convey calm. Joaquim explained the entire situation, from his debts to the Shadow's threat. Pedro was silent for a few moments, thinking, "Joaquim, this situation is serious. I don't know if I can help with the money, but maybe we can find another way out. We need to think of something." The two spent hours discussing alternatives, but nothing seemed viable. The tension was rising, and the deadline given by the Shadow was running out. Joaquim returned home even more desperate, with no solution in sight. On the night before the final deadline, Joaquim was sitting in the living room, staring intently at Maria's photo. His heart was heavy, and he knew he had to make a decision. He couldn't sacrifice his daughter. Suddenly, he had a desperate idea. He picked up the phone and called Pedro. "Pedro, I had an idea. It's risky, but it's the only chance I have," Joaquim said, his voice firm. "I'm going to try to negotiate directly with the Shadow. Maybe I can buy more time or find another solution." Pedro was worried, but he knew there wasn't much else to do. "Joaquim, be careful. The Shadow is not a man to be trifled with. I'll be here for whatever you need." With a heavy heart, Joaquim prepared for the meeting with the Shadow. He knew his life was at stake, but he couldn't give up. The hope of saving Maria drove him, and he was willing to face anything to protect his daughter. The week passed in a blur for Joaquim, and the final night arrived with an air of inevitability. He still had no solution to the deadly dilemma he faced. The next morning, While Maria was at work, two men dressed in black knocked on Joaquim's door. They were the Shadow's henchmen, and their cold looks left no doubt about why they were there. Joaquim, with a racing heart, allowed them to enter. "Are you ready to pay what you owe?" asked one of the men, in a tone that allowed no response beyond a simple yes or no. Joaquim nodded, the shame weighing on him like a suffocating blanket. "Will she know?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. The men just laughed. "She'll find out in due time," one of them replied as the other pulled out a cell phone and sent a quick message. Joaquim felt the panic rising in his chest. Was there hope? He looked at the door, wishing for something miraculous to happen to stop what was about to occur. But nothing happened. He was trapped in a reality he had created himself. When Maria returned home, she found the two men waiting for her. They were sitting on the couch while Joaquim paced back and forth, unable to look directly at his daughter. "What's going on?" she asked, confused and worried. The men stood up, and one of them approached her. "Your father made some bad decisions, and now you are the payment." Maria froze. The revelation that she had been sold by her own father was a crushing shock. She looked at Joaquim, hoping for a denial, an explanation, anything that would negate the truth forming in her mind. But he just lowered his head, unable to face the disappointment in his daughter's eyes. "This can't be happening," she murmured, feeling tears begin to form. But it was. The men grabbed her by the arms, ignoring her protests and struggles. Joaquim finally looked at her, his eyes filled with tears and remorse. "I'm sorry," he managed to say, but the words were empty and too late. Maria was taken to the black car parked in front of the house, while the weight of betrayal crashed down on her like a storm. In the car, as she was being driven to an unknown destination, Maria tried to process what had happened. Her father had sold her like a commodity. The pain of betrayal was unbearable, but she decided that, for now, she needed to stay strong. There was a chance, however small, that she could escape or find a way to save herself. She clung to this fragile hope as the car sped down the dark road. Upon arriving at the destination, Maria was taken to a dark room and locked in. She sat on the cold floor, hugging her knees, and tried not to think about what might happen next. Instead, she focused on finding a way to escape. She knew she needed to be smart and patient. Time seemed to drag on, but she refused to give up. Meanwhile, Joaquim was desolate. Sitting in his empty house, he couldn't get the image of Maria being taken away out of his mind. He knew he had made an irreparable mistake. He was desperate, but he had no strength to do anything. Guilt and regret consumed him. He turned to alcohol, trying to drown his pain and shame. Pedro, knowing of Joaquim's despair, went to visit him. "Joaquim, you can't give up. We need to find a way to save Maria," Pedro said, trying to lift his friend's spirits. Joaquim looked at Pedro with empty eyes. "I don't know what to do, Pedro. I lost her. How can I live with myself knowing what I've done?" Joaquim replied, his voice choked with pain. Pedro took a deep breath. "Joaquim, you can still do the right thing. Let's go to the police. Maybe we can come up with a plan to rescue Maria." Joaquim, hesitant, finally agreed. They went to the police station and told the entire story to the detective in charge, who promised to do everything possible to help. Joaquim knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in days, he felt a spark of hope. The following days were a blur of fear and uncertainty for Maria. She was taken to an isolated house, far from the city and any immediate chance of rescue. The house was large and luxurious, a golden prison. Maria was locked in an upstairs room with windows overlooking a vast forest. She could hear the sounds of nature, but she couldn't leave. Two men kept constant watch, guarding her day and night. At first, Maria was terrified. Her father's betrayal had left her in shock, and the idea of being in the hands of criminals was terrifying. But as the days turned into weeks, something inside her began to change. Anger and determination started to replace the fear. She swore to herself that somehow she would find a way to escape, and, if possible, she would avenge what had happened. She began carefully observing her captors, trying to find a weakness she could exploit. She noticed that one of the guards, Paolo, seemed more relaxed and less attentive to his duties than the other. She decided that he might be her starting point. One night, Maria called Paolo to the room. "Paolo, please, can I talk to you?" She tried to sound as calm as possible. Paolo entered, looking suspicious. "What do you want?" he asked, crossing his arms. Maria took a deep breath, trying to hide her nervousness. "I know you're not to blame for any of this. I just wanted to talk to someone. I'm so lonely here," she said, her voice sweet and vulnerable. Paolo hesitated for a moment, then relaxed a bit. "Okay, but be quick," he said, closing the door behind him. Maria took the opportunity to start a conversation, trying to gain his trust. Over the next few days, she continued to get closer to Paolo, using each interaction to learn more about the house and the guard schedules. She learned that Paolo liked to play cards and used that to her advantage, challenging him to games and winning his sympathy. Meanwhile, Joaquim was in constant contact with the police. The plan was to gather enough information to plan a rescue. Pedro was also involved, helping to monitor the Shadow's movements and his men. The detective in charge, Oliveira, suggested that Joaquim try to arrange a meeting with the Shadow, claiming he had the money. It would be a trap to lure the criminal and give the police a chance to intervene. Joaquim, nervous but determined, agreed. He set up the meeting in a public place, hoping that the presence of witnesses would inhibit any immediate violence. On the scheduled day, he arrived at the location accompanied by Oliveira and an undercover police team. As they waited, Joaquim's heart raced. He knew everything could go wrong, but he was willing to risk everything to save his daughter. When the Shadow arrived, accompanied by a few henchmen, the tension in the air was palpable. "Did you bring the money?" the Shadow asked, getting straight to the point. Joaquim looked at him, trying to remain calm. "I brought a proposal. We can resolve this another way," he replied firmly. The Shadow laughed, but before he could respond, the police moved in. Within seconds, the place was surrounded, and the Shadow's men were subdued. The Shadow was arrested, but Joaquim knew the job wasn't over yet. They still needed to find Maria. Hours had passed since Joaquim was locked in the room. He was lying on the cold floor, trying to process the last conversation he had with his daughter. The coldness in Maria's voice haunted him. He had never seen her like that. He tried to get up, but his limbs ached terribly from the beatings he had endured. He was exhausted and hungry, but worst of all was the fear of what was to come. Finally, the door opened, and the Shadow entered, a triumphant smile on his face. "So, Joaquim, it seems things aren't going well for you," he taunted as he approached. Joaquim tried to speak, but his throat was dry and sore. The Shadow continued, "You thought you could fool me, that you could escape the consequences of your actions?" Joaquim tried to explain, but the words came out as incoherent whispers. The Shadow crouched down, getting face to face with Joaquim. "Your daughter has been very useful to me," he said with a tone of satisfaction. "She's smart, beautiful, and as you may have noticed, she's expecting my child." The revelation hit Joaquim like a punch in the gut. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. "No, this can't be true," he murmured, feeling despair rising within him. The Shadow laughed. "Oh, but it is. She became my woman, and she's expecting a child. And you're just a pawn in my game." Maria entered the room at that moment, her face expressionless. Joaquim looked at her, searching for some sign that this was all a misunderstanding, but found nothing. "Maria, please forgive me," he pleaded, tears streaming down his face. "I know I made a mistake, but please, don't do this." Maria looked at him for a long moment, and then, to everyone's surprise, smiled. "Do you really think I'm on his side?" she asked, addressing the Shadow. Before he could react, Maria pulled out a gun and pointed it at him. "This ends now." Before the Shadow could react, the door was kicked open by a team of police officers. Within seconds, the room was filled with officers who quickly disarmed and arrested the Shadow and his men. Joaquim, still stunned by what was happening, was untied and taken outside. He looked at Maria, who was now talking to one of the officers. "Maria, what's going on?" he asked, still not fully understanding the situation. Maria turned to him, her expression serious. "I've been working with the police from the beginning," she explained. "I infiltrated the Shadows organization to help bring him down. And you, Dad, were an important part of that." Joaquim was silent, unable to process everything at once. His daughter, whom he had betrayed so horribly, had become a crucial piece in the capture of a dangerous criminal. The irony of the situation was overwhelming. He looked at her, now with a mix of pride and shame. "Maria, he began, but she raised her hand, cutting him off. "There's nothing more to say, Dad. You made your choice and I made mine. Now I have to move on." With the Shadow in prison and the police operation complete, Maria prepared to move on with her life. The criminal's arrest had been a success, and she had played a crucial role in the operation. However, the complexity of her emotions toward her father still lingered. Joaquim had been released, but the weight of his actions still haunted him. Joaquim, now free but with a devastated soul, found himself at a crucial point in his life. He had lost everything, including the trust and love of his daughter. He knew he needed to seek redemption, but he didn't know where to start. The guilt over what he had done consumed him. Maria was pregnant, and he knew he had a responsibility to her and the future grandchild who would soon come into the world. However, he knew it was unlikely she would forgive him or allow him to be a part of her life. In a final desperate gesture of reconciliation, Joaquim sought out Maria. He wanted to apologize, offer any kind of support he could, but she was determined to distance herself from him. "I need time, Dad," she said, her voice firm but with a shadow of sadness. "You made your choice, and now I need to make mine." Joaquim respected her decision, but the pain of separation was unbearable. He watched her leave, knowing that he would likely never have the chance to redeem himself. Meanwhile, Maria moved to a small coastal town, a peaceful place where she could raise her child in peace. She had decided that the best thing for her and the baby was to distance herself from everything that reminded her of the painful past. The house she chose was simple but cozy, with a beautiful view of the ocean. She spent her days preparing for the baby's arrival and sometimes found herself thinking about her father. Despite everything, she felt a twinge of compassion for him, but she couldn't simply forgive and forget what had happened. Joaquim had sold his own daughter, and that was a deep wound, difficult to heal. As Maria tried to rebuild her life, Joaquim wandered the city, lost in his own thoughts. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he wanted, somehow, to become a better person. He started attending support meetings for gambling addicts, trying to take a step in the right direction. Each day was a struggle against his impulses, but he was determined to change. Months passed, and Maria gave birth to a healthy baby girl. The birth of the child brought a new perspective to her life. She felt a wave of unconditional love for her daughter, a love she never imagined she could feel. She decided to name the girl Hope, a symbolic choice to mark a new beginning. Little Hope became the center of her life, and Maria devoted herself entirely to caring for her. However, the arrival of her daughter also brought to the surface complex emotions. Maria couldn't help but think about how her own life story was filled with pain and betrayal, and she swore that her daughter would never go through anything similar. Determined to offer a better future for Hope, she continued to keep her distance from everything that reminded her of the past, including Joaquim. Meanwhile, Joaquim continued his journey of recovery. He knew that Maria's forgiveness might never fully come, but the fact that she had responded to his letter gave him new hope. He continued to work and stay sober, seeking ways to be useful and help others. Life was simple and often lonely, but he clung to the hope that one day he could look back and see that, despite everything, he had managed to do something good. Now, with hope in her arms, Maria finally felt at peace. She had moved far from the dark past and was determined to raise her daughter in an environment filled with love and security. However, the ghost of her father still loomed over her. Despite everything he had done, she couldn't stop thinking about him. The truth was, Despite her anger and pain, there was still love for him somewhere in her heart. Joachim, for his part, was determined to prove that he could change. He stayed sober and continued attending support meetings. Each day without gambling was a small victory, and he began to feel more confident in his ability to change. He knew that the road to redemption would be long and arduous, but he was willing to do whatever it took. Eventually, Joachim decided to write a new letter to Maria. He knew that words could not undo what he had done, but he wanted to express his feelings of regret and love. In the letter, he wrote about his struggles with addiction, how he regretted his choices, and how he hoped that, one day, he could earn her forgiveness. He didn't ask to be a part of her life again. He just wanted her to know that he was changing and that he would always be there for her if she needed him. Maria received the letter with conflicting feelings. She had built a new life for herself and hope, and the last thing she wanted was to bring back the turmoil of the past. However, as she read her father's words, she felt a wave of compassion. She knew that forgiveness was a difficult choice but necessary for her own peace of mind. She decided that, for now, she would not respond to the letter. She needed time to process her feelings and decide what to do. Meanwhile, Joachim continued to live his life one day at a time. He found a modest job at a convenience store and started saving money, hoping that one day he could offer something to Maria and Hope, even if it was just a token of his remorse. He knew he could never erase the past, but he was determined to build a better future. A few months later, Maria decided to take a small step toward reconciliation. She wrote a reply letter to Joachim, thanking him for his words and saying she was glad he was trying to change. She didn't promise that she would forgive him completely, but she said she was open to a conversation in the future. It was a small gesture, but to Joachim it meant the world. Maria remained focused on being the best mother she could be for Hope. The little girl was a constant source of joy and hope. Maria dedicated herself to creating an environment full of love and support for her daughter, determined to break the cycle of pain that had marked her own life. She knew that the path to healing would be long, but she was willing to face each challenge with courage and determination. Meanwhile, Joachim, upon receiving Maria's letter, felt a new hope blossom within him. He knew that the reconciliation process would be long and that he still had much to prove. However, the mere possibility of a future where he could somehow redeem himself gave him a new purpose. Joachim decided to continue working on himself and staying focused on his recovery. He knew he couldn't force Maria to forgive him, but he was willing to wait and continue showing, through actions, that he had changed. Each day without giving in to his addiction was a victory, and he clung to these small victories to keep moving forward.